Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Itachi was interested in having a child. Petunia performs a bit of accidental magic. It says something about her parenting that Uchiha Itachi is considered a better prospect for raising a child. Young Hari is raised by one of the most infamous nukenin of all time and a cadre of uncles whose cumulative effect is very prominent. And someone had the bright idea to bring him back to England. Merlin helps them all. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 84, The First Task I. Welcome Hogwarts. Lee Jordan's voice boomed through the arena. While Ludo Bagman had been the original choice for announcing, when he had done a runner, it had become abundantly obvious that they'd need to find a replacement. Given, Dumbledore had pointed out, that Hogwarts had someone who regularly announced sporting events anyway. Was there really a need to go trying to find someone special? It hadn't gone over well, but there'd been only a little time to try and get a professional. In the meantime, Jordan was what they had. Not welcoming the deceased losers in the pit. Let's hear it for the official beginning of the Tri-Wizard tournament. There was some polite clapping. As you well know, the first event took place at the end of October, but the judges have yet to award points. In the meantime, we're going to watch some underprepared idiots, our own Miss Girl Toby, and the badass Professor Potter face off against the poor opening challenge, nesting dragons. That's right, my fellow students, Jordan's voice sounded only partly excited. We're going to watch them attempt to get a golden egg out of a nesting mother's clutch. By hook or by crook, they'll evade or negate dragonfire and some fearsome natural weapons to steal the most precious thing a mother has. First up is, there was a pause as he checked the notes Percy Weasley had shoved into his hands a few minutes ago. Miss Fleur Delacour against a Chinese fireball. I'm sure you all know that Miss Delacour is a beautiful young woman, but she is so much more than that. She is, in fact, another pause and some vaguely heard muttering. A demi-human. The lovely lady is a quarter Vila. For those of you who are interested in these things, I've been asked to do a bit of flavor commentary while the handlers get the dragon in position. Indeed, down below were a dozen witches and wizards busily using a mix of goading hexes and chains to get a huge, orange-red dragon into the middle of the arena, while several more carted along the eggs. The Chinese fireball is not a native of the Far East. It was given that name when it was first discovered by a pair of witches in Kent. The name is a reference to the drooping whisker-like protrusions from its snout, something that was believed at the time to be a feature of men from China. Considering our own headmaster, I am proposing we call it the Hogwarts Fireball. It's even in our motto. What? Oh. Sorry, Professor. The moment of quiet was just long enough to notice before Lee Jordan spoke again. And there she is, coming into the pit now. Miss Delacour is hot, hot, hot. It was a literal statement. Her normally attractive features were somehow more so, while at the same time, slightly drawn back and sharp. It gave her a face that drew to mind a hunting bird. More to the point, she was on fire. Flames hissed from her mouth in white-hot streams and surrounded her arms, giving her whole body an obscuring heat haze. At the sound of the gong, she will have 15 minutes to complete the task. A gong sounded. It was mixed with a crack of superheating air, human ears unable to identify the amount of time between the start of the gong's sound and that belonging to the passage of a giant fireball that appeared as nothing more than a streak of blue-white in the air. The dragon's head vanished in that instant, replaced with a stump of a neck and the lingering scent of cooked flesh. Fleur walked calmly to the center of the arena and picked up the golden egg. With what I'm sure is a new record, Jordan managed after a moment. Miss Delacour completed the first task in just 20 seconds. Let's hear from the judges. From the bottom of the magical bunker shot numbers. In a curlicued purple was an 8, in pastel blue was a 10, in pitch black was a 4, in red was a 7, and moments later a piece of wood was lowered down on a chain bearing a 9. And Miss Delacour takes the lead with 38 points. Let's see how her competition does. Up next is the handsome superstar, Victor Crum. Recently voted one of Europe's most desirable bachelors despite being in school. Does anyone else find that creepy? Rumor has it he's off the market. The scion of the notorious Bulstrode family has been seen in close company with the Quidditch star. He's facing a Ukrainian iron belly. These dragons are renowned for their magical resistance. Even amongst a species whose well-known traits include surviving the killing curse, these are specimens who are talked of as especially magic-resistant. See how the handlers are using only chains for this. Admittedly, 2 of the trainers were using animated chains to keep the mother from wandering off towards her clutch, but it was still only chains. Look at the flame it's breathing. I wonder whose is hotter, the dragons or the French champion. I know who is prettier. Sorry, Professor. Victor Crum walked out of the waiting tent looking unperturbed. It might be that his fellow champion had just killed a dragon in a gout of magical fire. It might be that he trusted in Professor Potter's work. It might even be that he was just a little crazy. Anyone who flew like him probably was. Most likely, though, it was the fresh marks on his neck and chest. English girls, he was discovering, were rather more cosmopolitan in their views on gender interactions. His father would definitely not have approved, would have boxed his ears and called Millie some rude names, but Crum could see the positives to it. He looked at the dragon. He was fairly certain that the French, which had acted on a spur of the moment, need to vent. Crum had planned this out since he'd learned what the task was. Everyone thought flying was something spontaneous. It was. But they didn't realize that he spent hours practicing and thinking about how he could be just that little bit better. That had let him single-handedly carry his team to the World Cup. Next time he'd try getting some people who could do more than sit around like idiots while he did the work. To tell the truth, he'd been expecting to be at least a little worried. Certainly, the dragon was big and scary, and had lots of fire breathing and magical immunities, but it wasn't freaking him out at all. He could worry about that later. His wand came up and described a quick series of motions. He'd had to adjust the plan a little, of course, because iron bellies were able to resist the spell he'd planned to use. But Millie had been kind enough to show him a technique that Professor Potter had developed. A meter-long steel spike appeared in the air, and was promptly launched at the dragon. One of the downsides to being so large was that small things were harder to track. To Crum, this was a gigantic piece of metal and hard to miss. For a dragon, though? It was going to find it difficult to see something like this. And, once it hit, it was having trouble seeing anything at all. The dragon thrashed about madly, roaring and trying to get the spike out of its eye. In the process, it crushed the eggs beneath it, all the while making desperate sounds of pain. Crum considered whether he'd just wait it out or not. He didn't really feel like going any nearer that mess than he had to, but if the handlers didn't decide that qualified as unruly, the dragon keened, and this time it was apparently the cue for the handlers to move in. While the men and women were occupied trying to work out how to control a magically resistant creature flailing about in pain, Crum decided that there were sufficient targets for the dragon and strolled over to the crushed remains of the eggs, collecting the metal one that had survived the encounter. It was a waste. He'd hoped it would punch through into the dragon's brain, but apparently dragon skulls were strong stuff. As it was, he felt mildly guilty that the creature hadn't had any choice in its involvement, and that his actions had cost it an entire clutch of eggs. He hoped dragons weren't particularly aware, because he'd hate for it to truly grasp what it had lost. He was going to need a lot to drink tonight. The judges conferred for long moments before assessing his performance. The purple score came out as 5, the pastel as a 4, the black as a 10, the red was a 6, and lowered down was a wooden 5. Crum would have liked better scores, but his plan hadn't worked as he'd wanted. It was about what he'd expected, including his headmaster ignoring his fuck-up. Well, the man had been a Death Eater, he probably wasn't too squeamish about the suffering of others. And Victor Crum gets a 30 from the judges. Came Lee Jordan's announcement for those in the audience who were unable to do basic arithmetic. Hopefully they'll share their logic with us later, especially the headmaster of Durmstrang, whose score is so out of place among his peers that it might be considered biased. Not that I'm accusing him, Professor. If I had to guess, it would be either the destruction of dragon eggs or pain and suffering. There goes Hogwarts' very own Charlie Weasley at the head of a squad, moving the dragon out of the arena. Whatever they'd use to calm it, I'd like to have a few around for finals. I could make a fortune selling them, but thought would bedangera sandai wouldn't, Professor. Jordan's Pavlovian training had kicked in, as Professor McGonagall was simply sitting beside him, watching the event and apparently unaware that he kept stepping over the line. In her defense, she was remembering the time that she had somehow been talked by a certain student into allowing a young James Potter to announce the GRYFF Slytherin game. After that, there was hardly any way for Jordan to end up out of line. Next up is our esteemed guest lecturer and most dangerous magical creature on the planet, Professor Potter. There was a deafening level of cheering going on, made worse by the number of students who, in contravention of the rules, had decided to use magic to add to the volume or, in the case of the twins, add a full brass band fanfare to the mix. "That's right!" shouted Jordan over the din. "We've never seen Professor Potter actually try, so many of us are looking forwards to a first-hand view of his abilities. There's even a rumor of a betting pool on what he'll do, but I'm sure that's not true. In the meantime, they're bringing out the Hungarian horntail. Widely renowned as just about the most viciously unfriendly being around, Professor Potter is facing off against it. Oh wow, that's the risk they take." One of the dragon handlers had gotten too close to the horntail, and it had whipped its namesake through the air and cleaved the woman in half. The crowd reacted quickly, shields going up to rebuff the flying bits of handler. The dragon roared its victory over one of the little creatures. "It looks like they've got it in position. Yes, there they go." The dragon handlers had locked down the chain attached to the dragon and proceeded to advance in the opposite direction with alacrity. Now we wait on Professor Potter to astound us in some way. The crowd went silent as Harry stepped out onto the field. The previous champions had put on interesting performances. The dragon was a gleaming beacon of magic to his eye. Regardless, it was a chance to find out if this had worked. He raised his thumb to his lips and let his incisor slice cleanly into it. That had been one of the biggest problems. He was really hard to cut now. A moment of focusing, and he pressed the wound to the ground. Smoke engulfed the whole arena. Arnold Lewis stared at the little figurine on his desk. He had a dozen things he should be doing, and he was instead staring at a thing made of twigs and string that had appeared the day before. Its intrinsic properties were harmless, yet somehow the thing had a disquieting aura that he found all too familiar. It was the same as the one that surrounded one of his most unusual employees. There was a reason he kept her on assignment as much as he could, but she only really had a working relationship with Kirkbane, so the rest of the time, she was pretty much free to do as she liked in the confines of the Dawn headquarters. Of course, headquarters was much larger than it had been when the boss had opened it. What with one thing and another, and his slowly growing library of files, and the need for a couple of people to manage the stacks, and his slowly increasing medical staff and Gormsheff's assistant, not to mention a barracks for when agents were on call, he'd ended up quietly taking over a few of the neighboring offices. The medical staff had come as something of a surprise, but he'd found that while there were only so many people who could afford to hire the Dawn to solve problems that needed a certain level of finality, the number of people who needed medical care that didn't ask questions and was willing to make house calls was rather high. Sure, the money wasn't quite as good on a per-case basis, but there was lots of work, and it wasn't like having a bunch of skilled people who knew how to handle the kinds of injuries the Dawn sometimes sustained on his payroll was a bad thing. Still, it meant that he had far more people working for him than he'd expected when he took the job. And then there was this. He supposed he could ask Gormsheff what the thing meant, but if he did, then he'd have to find out, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. Right now, he was able to almost pretend that it didn't matter and wasn't worrying him. There was a real danger that defense would vanish if he took steps to remedy his ignorance. Besides, he couldn't think of an answer that he would like. But it was still unnerving. He didn't dare destroy it, just in case it meant that someone that even Gormchev considered to be dangerously outside the bounds of reason would be offended. Which was why his morning was spectacularly unproductive. Chapter 85, First Task Part 2. Or All Hail the King. When the smoke cleared, there was a collective silence. Standing with a foot in the arena was a giant. That wasn't a good description, because this was to giants what giants were to mortal folk. It was easily as tall as the castle, if not taller. Most of the audience didn't recognize the outfit it wore. Some kind of boot made of hide with a metal guard over the calf. Thighs protected by a piece of metal covering much of the inner thigh as well as top and outer, over some sort of puffy cloth. Something that resembled a skirt made of metal plates extended from its waist. Stuffed through its belt were a pair of swords still in their sheaths, one half as tall as the figure, the other half that. On its other hip was a jug that resembled a two-part snowman with a cork in the top. Its chest was wrapped in more metal, though the stomach protruded in a round potbelly. Its face was shaded by a broad, straw hat. What could be made out was humanoid enough. The dragon had only two options when confronted with a creature that, were the dragon to rear up, the dragon would only reach its knee. One was flight, and that was out because it was nesting, and its eggs were right there. The other was fight. It chose the only valid option. A great belch of flame shot from its mouth into the creature's thigh. Ow. The voice was booming. Then it leaned down and a huge hand picked up the dragon by the neck. The head cocked to the side and the sun revealed a huge, ape's face, mouth opened. The dragon was lifted to that maw and it had time to breathe fire again before the top third of the dragon was bitten off. There were some sounds of mastication in the otherwise quiet arena. People watched in shock as an apex monster of the magical world was turned into a snack. The figure popped the cork on its flask and took a swig. Spicy. It took another bite and looked around, spotting what it was looking for down at its feet in what had been a nest full of eggs. Hello, Lord Summoner. Hiya. It appeared that Hari had amplified his voice, since it was loud enough to be more than just a shout. There was a pause. What do I call you? This one is Okong. The last of the dragon disappeared in a crunch. Nice of you to provide a snack on our first meeting. Not a problem. Hari turned to look up not at the giant, armored ape, but at the judge's booth. Do I get scores? Okong was roughly eye level with the observation bunker. And I almost the same size as it peered inside. They seem a bit distracted, my lord. He prodded the bunker with a massive finger. My lord wishes for your attention. A hatch opened and a red-haired young man poked his head out. Just a moment. They're debating. Yes, debating. Understood. Okong looked down. They are debating, Lord. He looked around with interest and began to lean down and examine things, sending many students reaching for wands just in case. The ape merely sniffed at parts of the stadium and mumbled to itself. From the bunker emerged a purple 7, a pastel 5, a black 2, a red 8, and a wooden 9. Sasori leaned out of the bunker. Hari? Yes? Did you make this contract yourself? Yep. The 9 was hurriedly pulled up on its chain and a 10 was lowered down in its place. And there you have it, Hogwarts. The well-known Professor Potter managed to astound us once again. Despite a distinct bias from the judges leaving him with only a 31 for a score, we are wowed by our professor's conjuration. Not a conjuration. Called Hari. Yes, Indy, wait, what? It's not conjured. Oh. Lee Jordan took a few moments and then picked up where he left off. Can it be any wonder that Professor Potter has done something as amazing as this? Ms. Riddle should remember to collect her winnings from Gred and Fred. How she knew that the answer was summon giant armored ape is beyond me, and if she weren't the second, maybe third, sorry headmaster, scariest person at Hogwarts, I might accuse her of cheating. Since she is, I can only assume that this was entirely fair and above board. Tam, from her seat in the crowd, had the same dumbfounded look as everyone else. She might have had some suspicions from what Harry had talked about with her, but this was well and truly beyond her wildest imagining. And while he no doubt didn't tell her everything, from what he had said, this was more than he'd expected either. But she wasn't surprised to find that he managed to act as though this were normal. He might even not be thrown. It was unfair, she decided, that despite her future self devoting a lifetime to the study of powerful and obscure magic, that the idiot who'd gone on a dark magic binge had nevertheless never managed anything remotely as impressive. It was all the more reason to not do something that stupid. Besides, thanks to Harry, she now understood when it was and wasn't acceptable to solve problems with violence. Okong vanished in a cloud of smoke a short time later, while the dragon handlers considered letters of resignation to avoid explaining this mess to their superiors. Some of them had argued against this whole plan, but they'd been overruled. With luck, the last competitor wouldn't do any lasting harm. Given how things had been going so far, though, they didn't hold out hope. This is neat. The foreign judges made squealing noises when Harry spoke. He had apparently conjured himself a chair and settled in to watch Girl Toby's attempt. Do you mind if I examine this to see how it works? After the tournament, Dumbledore held no illusions that if he tried to bar it outright, Professor Potter would ignore him. He hoped that by putting only limits, he might manage to put it off until destruction of the bunker wouldn't be a problem. All right. I'll find some other project to work on. Hey, Harry. Was that the boss of your contract? Nope. Sasori frowned. Mr. Dumbledore? Is there a way I can give a score greater than 10 with a caveat of horrified amazement? No. It's down to the last competitor. Lee Jordan declared. Girl Toby of Gryffindor is poised to astound us. Given that she is from the best house in the school, begging your forgiveness, Professor Potter, we can expect that she will carry the day. What can be said about the youngest champion? Seriously. Aside from knowing she's the lovely Daphne Greengrass's sister, and a rampaging terror of random insanity, I'm not sure I have anything to work with. Someone should have done a better job prepping my notes. I suppose I can at least mention some of her more notable pranks. She regularly gets into a fight over maple syrup with Ronald Weasley, and has taken to stealing his food for reasons that I cannot fathom. She once transfigured every pair of jockeys and boxers in Gryffindor Tower into lacy G-strings, although I can't prove it was her, but the fact that they all read Girl Toby was here is a definite hint. She sabotaged every school broom so they would start to sweep the halls while being ridden. And she's responsible for our random alertness checks, which have only gotten more enthusiastic since Alastair Moody was deputized to handle them. Well, I know that I'm rooting for the dragon now. I'm sure many others are as well. Come on, dragon. Let's see a champion die. There was a roar of applause. Girl Toby emerged from the tent with a determined walk. That lasted up until she saw the dragon. Cool. She ran over to the dragon, ducking between its claws to clamber up its back and pet it. Oh wow, you're big, aren't you? Girl Toby held on, still petting away as it tried shaking its head to get her off. When that didn't work, it raised a claw and swatted, sending her rolling on the ground. She popped back up and bounced out of the way of a jet of flame. Again. She dodged again and leapt over a third. You're not very good at this, Mr. Dragon. She partly lifted her mask and spat a fireball that flew across the field and smacked the confused dragon between the eyes. You have to hit the target. Now you try. Nowhere near me that time, she scolded. The dragon was busy blinking, trying to see clearly after having its face filled with fire. It fumbled around and grabbed a rock, heaving it at the girl while shoot more flames into the bargain. Better. Now you're trying. She called as she landed on the flying boulder and let it carry her to the far wall. But you still can't hit me. She considered. You're not a mister, are you? You're a girl, right? Well, fine, don't answer. Girl Toby stomped her foot and then rolled to the side to left the grass she'd been standing on turned to ash. You seem grumpy. She dashed over and began scratching the dragon's belly. Maybe a tummy rub will help you? She slipped between its legs as it tried to immolate her again. Maybe not. And on it went. Girl Toby was clearly enjoying her fight, although someone had apparently forgotten to inform her that's what it was. The dragon had managed to nearly set fire to several students in its attempts to destroy the tiny annoyance. The stands had claw marks and many of the students had wisely decided to move upwards to avoid further collateral damage. Finally, there was a blare of sound. And we're out of time. Lee Jordan called. The handlers are having an easy time with this one. Not only is it not injured, but the dragon definitely seems tired. I didn't know dragons could pant. Yes, it's being moved off the field in record time. This dragon is probably the winner as the only one of 4 to escape without injury or death. And there's a handler explaining to Girl Toby that she can't stay and pet the dragon. Now here come the judges. They've lowered the bunker now that the dragons are gone, and I think they're about to have a short talk with the youngest champion. Miss Girl Toby. Dumbledore frowned slightly. You've put us in a bit of a spot, young lady. You see, there was never really so odd a failure in the tournament's history. Mr. Weasley, would you explain? Yes, Headmaster. The problem is that while there had been plenty of times where the champion has failed to complete a task or even failed to try to complete it, there had yet to have been an instance of someone doing something that demonstrated great skill and utterly failing to try to complete their assigned task. What task? Girl Toby's head cocked to the side. The golden egg. She considered this for a few moments. Nope. I don't think anyone said anything about it to me. Not when I was paying attention. Could you tell me now so I can do it properly? You were supposed to collect a faux dragon egg made of gold from the clutch of real eggs the mother was guarding. I was? Yes. Can I go do that? No. Snarled Karkaroff. Oh. Well, I found this. Will it do? Girl Toby held out a golden dragon egg. Boss. Included with my regular report is my first treatise on what I'm informed are called practitioners. According to my sources, no one seems to know exactly when or where the practice first emerged. There appear to be fragmentary records going back thousands of years across the world. Because of this, I can't give quite as concise a history as I'd like. I can't even begin to guess where exactly it started, nor exactly how it spread. I know that they keep to themselves for the most part. They fear detection in much the way that we do, but for a very different reason. The practice involves behavior that is generally frowned upon. I've chosen to so far remain ignorant of the exact nature of the rituals involved, but the end result is almost invariably traffic with some sort of spirit or entity of an odd nature. Spirits of the departed, but not ghosts, things that embody concepts or places or things, and other creatures of power who make deals or accept payment. As such, they have only the vaguest idea of how many others engage in the practice in their region, let alone the world. Aside from sometimes sharing notes and working together to achieve specific goals or prevent discovery, practitioners tend to be solitary or, at most, working in pairs. From the ones I've encountered, there is a certain level of megalomania required for someone to take up with the kinds of spirits they deal with, a degree of self-assured arrogance that they will get away unscathed. It's possible that others also get involved, but I suspect that they don't survive long. I'd like to give you a more complete profile of an average member of this secret society, but aside from possessing those personality traits, I'm not sure if there's any common factor. Men and women are equally drawn to the power offered, and from what I'm told, there isn't really an ethnic divide either. People will grab for power where they can. Technology doesn't even seem to be a barrier, as places with lower technological capabilities have less ability to police the actions of those who are part of the practice, so while they are forced to rely more on word of mouth or apprenticeship, they are consequently better hidden. I will include more with my next report. Arnold Lewis. Effective Director of the Dawn. Chapter 86, It's Crazier Than You Thought. Where the hell did she get it? Demanded Karkaroff. The judges were sitting in Dumbledore's office, staring at a golden egg on his desk. I really couldn't say, Igor. Dumbledore was prodding it with his wand. This is certainly the fourth egg that we made. It has our signatures and the invisible rune and everything. How can you see an invisible rune? Asked Percy. So where did she get a fifth egg? Maxime was in a creaking armchair, glaring at the subject of their inquiry. Because the other champions all have theirs. I realize I'm a bit out of my depth here, Sasori offered. But did you examine the egg, miss? He seemed not to relish the words he was about to say. Girl Toby acquired? Oh, of course I did. Dumbledore sat back and slipped his wand into his sleeve. And it appears to be the genuine article. It has the judges' signatures, the invisible rune, everything really. Are you telling me? Growled Karkaroff. That we have 5 prizes for the 4 champions of the Triwizard Tournament? I can't see how we can come to another conclusion, Igor. That certainly is what the facts indicate. If you have another theory, you are welcome to speculate. That is why we're here, discussing it instead of enjoying a rather nice, warm dinner and several cups of tea. You could always have food sent up, Maxime put in. An uncultured, barbaric Briton would surely have thought of that. I did. But I don't allow food in this office. Crumbs are quite troublesome when constructing small, magical doodads. Back to the subject at hand. Karkaroff looked like he was thinking of slamming his hand down on Dumbledore's desk and reconsidered. Perhaps you cheated, Dumbledore. It's not unheard of. I'm sure Mr. Weasley could rattle off the exact precedents. But could he have duplicated our signatures, Igor? Maxime asked. I would love to blame him, but unless you can explain how that was done, that suggestion's not going anywhere. Might I add, said Dumbledore, that she demonstrated that she clearly could have grabbed the egg, given her antics. It seems odd that I would cheat to help someone who clearly didn't need help. Though on the subject of cheating, might I ask how come your champions seemed unsurprised by the task? Never mind those kinds of accusations, said Igor hurriedly. Far too late for that talk now, added Madame Maxime. I had nothing to do with it, put in Sasori. Well, since that's dealt with, perhaps we can deal with the other question, scoring. 0. Thank you, Igor, I will take that under advisement. Well, Albus, Maxime said slowly, the thing is that even if, as you said, she could complete the task, she still didn't. Really? Because I seem to recall her holding a golden dragon egg at the end of the task. You know she didn't retrieve it properly. This time Karkaroff did smack the desk and found himself the subject of a steady gaze. I'm not sure I know that, Igor. To tell the truth, I am truly perplexed on the matter. But she met the requirements of the task. On a technicality, pointed out Maxime. The egg she was to grab was definitely still in the clutch. I hate to interrupt 3 August personages, Percy cleared his throat. But as the only person here who has actually read the rules, Sasori coughed. Only wizard here who has read the rules, perhaps I should speak? As much as the 3 of you are clearly enjoying your argument, it might help if I injected some facts. To that point, the whole argument is moot. The rules don't actually speak on the matter of task completion to score requirement. It is strongly implied that success is required, but nothing outright. So everyone is pretty much free to score as they see fit. I'd considered pointing this out earlier, but since you all were having so much fun, I decided to wait. Now, however, I'm getting hungry. And now, Lee Jordan's voice boomed through the great hall. We've all been eagerly awaiting the scoring for the Hogwarts champion. The judges have left their seclusion and are ready to dig into their dinners with a gusto I've rarely seen away from my house table. Look at those utensils fly. I do believe that Dumbledore and Percy Weasley are using their forks to spar over a pork chop, and yes, Karkaroff has stolen the remains of Professor Snape's veal cutlet. Madame Maxime has begun eating a whole turkey. They must have been hungry. It was at that point that Professor McGonagall got fed up and silenced Jordan. After 15 minutes of speedy consumption, the judges let out satisfied burps, excluding Sasori, who had been fiddling with a launching mechanism instead of eating, and proceeded to raise their wands. From Dumbledore's wand shot a purple 10 and the subheading because Igor. From Madame Maxime's wand came a pastel 4. From Karkaroff's wand came the shocking 0. From Percy Weasley's wand came a bright red 10 and the subheading Gryffindor rocks. Sasori held up a 6. And there you have it. Lee Jordan shouted, although not amplified. Girl Toby comes away with a 30, taking 10s from 2 judges. Go Hogwarts! The headlines in the Prophet were lurid. Massacre at Hogwarts! They screamed. Below were pictures of a corpse and a mutilation. The article launched into a diatribe against irresponsible dragon handlers, who let their valuable charges be placed in positions where they were killed, eaten, or maimed. 2 clutches of eggs had been lost, from 2 rare and valuable breeds. The blame, insisted the Prophet, lay squarely on the handlers. Crackpot fool and General any ne'er-do-well, Albus Dumbledore was quoted as saying that perhaps some of the blame belonged to whoever'd had the bright idea to use dragons for a task involving schoolchildren, but the evidence of death and violence was held as proof that the task was reasonable. Each champion's task was given a summation which focused heavy praise on Girl Toby and Victor Crum, while remaining entirely silent on Professor Potter, whose picture had gotten lost, and suggesting that the enchanting Ms. Delacour was a French tart who had seduced the dragon, but this was printed with about the standard level of invective for the Prophet's view of the French, so Fleur just immolated the copy in her hands and left it at that. An entire article was devoted to speculation on Ms. Delacour's bloodline, since no Vila could destroy a dragon with her fire. Various experts had increasingly outlandish suggestions that played well on the cosmopolitan lifestyle the French were assumed to lead. In keeping with the Prophet's standards, the actual lurid details were kept to a minimum, and it was treated about as close to an actual scientific presentation as the paper ever reached. Teenwich Weekly had a cover with Victor Crum holding a beaming Millie. He'd given an interview about how they had begun their whirlwind romance, and that he planned to ask for her hand when she came of age. Millie received a congratulatory copy from her mother and a collection of death threats with various levels of intensity, likelihood, and fury. Harry casually zapped several letters before Millie could open them, while he had a conversation with Tam. Hexed was all he said on the matter. Harry blinked. I don't recall seeing your name on the roster, Mr. Crum. Victor Crum sat beside Millie, wand at the ready. I attend classes with Millie. I have no instructors of my own. Harry shrugged. I think Professor Headmaster said something about waivers. Waivers. You'll need to see him about one. In the meantime, I guess I shall have to put the lesson on hold so we can evaluate your level of skill. This time, he didn't blink. Hello. I double-checked after the class earlier, so I know you're not on my roster. Fleur shrugged. I signed a waiver at lunch. It was rather comprehensive. I figure that this tournament is no doubt going to continue to be dangerous, so best if I take steps now. Your command of English is improving. Harry motioned the other students to the side. Time for an evaluation. And I can satisfy my own personal curiosity. Do you have any innate resistance to fire? His smile was all teeth. Professor Potter. Professor Headmaster. Did you find that your fellow competitors were somehow a threat to you? No, of course not. Then would you care to explain why both have spent a great deal of time in hospital over the last few days? They attended classes. Skill evaluations are ongoing. I think they signed the waivers. Did they? Dumbledore rifled through the paperwork on his desk. So they did. That was most foolish of them. On a similar note, I've been getting complaints that your classes have not been instructive. Could you perhaps do the evaluations outside of the regular coursework? I suppose I could. I've got a few projects that need seeing to, but aside from that, things are spinning along nicely. Good, good. Have a pleasant evening. Please. You have to help us. The Slytherins looked at the interlopers. They had been engaged in their usual mealtime activity of gossiping, eating, and plotting the downfall of their parents so that they could inherit the family fortune. Intruding on that normal state of affairs were a group of the enemy, that is to say, Gryffindors, led by the twins. The pair of prefects glanced at each other and at Daphne, all gauging who had the honor/duty to speak first. Why? Asked Fleur, ignoring the entire power struggle. The egg, said Gred. Girl Toby won't close it, added Forge. If the two of you continue to split sentences, I will immolate this entire delegation. Fleur narrowed her eyes and one slim hand rose, cupping a white-hot flame. Now explain. While little other than their professors frightened Professor Potter's students, a girl who had literally decapitated a dragon with just a bolt of fire was on the short list. There was a quiet bit of muttering as people worked out a sacrificial lamb. Eventually, Ron was shoved forwards. It's Girl Toby's egg. She opened it right after the task, and she hasn't shut it yet. It's unbearable. She keeps it in the common room, and we can't sleep anymore. We've tried to silence it and everything, but nothing works, and anyone who tries to move it spends the next 2 hours dangling from the window by his ankles. You've got to help us. Fleur glanced at Harry and, finding no insight there, replied with, Why? Put it under water. Crum's voice came from further down the table where he'd been having a quiet meal with his girlfriend. When Harry's one eye stared at him and Fleur actually glared, he shrugged. What? They need help. Thanks. Ron nearly bowed to the floor. You're the best. He paused. Excepting Professor Potter, of course. Fleur cleared her throat. And the esteemed and merciful Miss Delacour? When no fire burned him alive, he wiped sweat from his brow and beat a hasty retreat. You shouldn't help them. To quote you, why? Because this is a competition. We're both being trained by a champion, though. Yeah. Do you think that's going to matter? True. Harry was apparently unaware of the exchange and went back to his meal. Say it, bitches. Dumbledore made a come-on motion with his hands at the other judges sitting in front of his desk. Come on, say it. No. Igor growled at the man. I'm at half-mast, I need to hear you say it. And Igor was cut off by a huge hand over his face. You were right, Dumbledore. Dumbledore relaxed back in his chair. I needed that. He pointed at the copy of the Prophet that was spread on his desk. So nice of you to join me. I feel vindicated in knowing that we do, indeed, need more difficult tasks. Ones that, maybe, shouldn't risk valuable magical creatures, Do you have any ideas? Asked Sasori. Or are you just rubbing it in their faces? Mostly the rubbing thing. Say, you know Professor Potter's abilities. You should come up with a task. We're going to want more than 3. It's not like we can just cancel the ones we've got in planning now. Sasori stroked his chin. This will need some thinking. Good, good. It doesn't have to be right now. Come up with a plan for me in a week. And the rest of you should try and come up with things that we can do without needing too much more money or imports, since the ministry will bitch and moan if we have to ignore duties and customs again. Now get out of my office, I need to clean off. Boss. Included with my report is my next installment on the group of individuals known as practitioners. As best as I can tell, few, if any, practitioners are aware of the existence of magic. For all their interest in what Muggles consider the occult, they are rather similar to Muggle scientists. They try things to see if they work and record their findings to share with others in exchange for their knowledge. They tend to travel in circles far from our own, though it might be more fair to say that we travel in different circles from them. We keep to ourselves. They do as well, though they have more interaction with Muggle society than we do. Magic has uneven reactions with practitioner abilities. As an experiment, I sent Mr. Gormchev, our in-house specialist, to the Leaky Cauldron. He reported that he could certainly see a rundown pub, and a steady stream of people in dresses going in and out, but that he didn't feel any real desire to investigate. He wasn't able to state with certainty whether it was just that he had no interest, or if an outside force was suppressing his innate curiosity as a practitioner. Which brings me to something that I should have stated outright earlier: practitioners are exclusively Muggle. As far as I know, there aren't any magicals who engage in the practice, and I'm reluctant to take the step of attempting it myself at the moment, as it comes with a fairly high rate of failure, the causes of which are only partly understood by practitioners. I can't say I am entirely comfortable with what I have so far discovered, but despite being a man with disturbing hobbies that even as a member of the Dawn, I at least find questionable, I will readily admit that I'm glad he's on my payroll and, therefore, inside the tent and pissing out. He has yet to display the full breadth of his capabilities, but he has been of great use on a few occasions, and the rest of the time he has been of great aid in increasing the security of the Home Office. While he has few contacts here in England, he has also been invaluable when we have work in the contiguous colonies. He knows people in just about every major population center there, and they are more than willing to do him a favor if he does one for them. Though practitioners come from all walks of life and social levels, our man is a member of the upper crust across the pond, and his tentacles are everywhere. They aren't much use for our network, they are nevertheless a useful resource when it comes to operations. It is also thanks to him that we have what might be our most dangerous asset, though she might better qualify as a dangerously unstable bomb. Arnold Lewis, Effective Director of the Dawn. Chapter 87, Off-School Grounds. Does the task need to be on school grounds? Dumbledore looked at Sasori, wondering how the hell the young man had managed to get into his office without magic. Thankfully, years of being a schoolmaster meant that his instinctive reaction to surprise was to wandlessly cast a defensive spell, rather than how he had reacted during the war, which had involved a messy death. As such, he merely cocked his head for a moment as his brain caught up with what had been said. Well, as far as I know, it does. You should ask Mr. Weasley about it, though. The rules are quiet on the matter. I made sure to read them thoroughly. This is why I'm asking. It appears that it is assumed that they will on campus, but there's no actual stipulation to that end. I think it's just that most schools don't have the option of setting up dangerous tasks outside of their grounds. In that case, I don't think it's necessary. Dumbledore frowned. Would I regret asking the reason for your question? If you want deniability? Yes. I'll need access to someone who can make the devices called portkeys. That can be arranged. I do need to know, in broad terms, what the task is. Sasori smiled. Ignore Karkaroff sat down opposite Dumbledore. I have devised a task, Dumbledore. Oh good. It is a flying competition. Dumbledore sighed and then nodded. I am truly shocked, you know. I can't imagine how the idea came to you. Surely it has nothing to do with your champion being a world-famous Quidditch player. Of course not, Dumbledore. Karkaroff looked affronted. It was merely the best idea for how to fairly measure the abilities of the competitors. How could you suggest that I would devise a task intended to allow the best champion an easy victory? Rather easily, Igor. Is there anything I need to know so we can prepare? Well, it would be best if the competitors all had identical brooms, admitted the Durmstrang headmaster. Otherwise, I'm sure you'll cry foul when Victor uses his top-of-the-line broom. So maybe the school could lend a few of its. He seemed to be having trouble thinking of the right word, his face screwed up in distaste. Quality models for the race? I'm sure we can manage that. I was expecting much worse, really. Well, we might need to enchant some cameras. Really? Yes. Oh, and it's off campus. Dumbledore frowned. Is it? Oh yes. Dumbledore. I have a task. Of course, you do. It's been that kind of day. It will require us to contact the Egyptian ministry. I see. Professor Dumbledore. I've been expecting you, Mr. Weasley. Wait, before you speak, let me guess, you've devised a task. Well, yes. It no doubt plays to the strengths of the champion you favor. Now that you mention it. And it takes place off school grounds. How did you know? I have an O+ in divination. Gosh. I didn't know they gave those. That's what makes it so amazing. Perhaps you can cut to the chase and tell me what headache this will entail. Well, there may be some issues with imports. Oh joy. I love being assailed by paperwork. Just wondering, Professor Dumbledore, why are we all reporting to you? Aren't you technically just another judge? I mean, if anyone is in charge, wouldn't it be the ministry? And yet here you are, reporting to me. I'm not stupid, headmaster. A week after the first task, Harry got a letter at breakfast. He stopped eating and opened it, checking with his Sharingan. Yes, he'd read it correctly. That was unexpected. He finished eating and then rose. Professor Headmaster? I need to make a short trip into London today. Not a problem. While you're there, would you please pick up 16 pounds of lemon drops and another 10 of assorted candies? The student body shivered collectively when it dawned on them that they would be studying with Professor Moody, who seemed to have something to prove. Arnold. Despite the fact that he hadn't seen his boss appear, the executive director of the Dawn didn't jump. He just smiled. Hey, boss. Am I seeing things correctly? Yep. Oh. Good. He faced the prospective client. Sorry about that, but you understand my need for confirmation. Now, what seems to be the problem you'd like sorted out? My uncle. He killed my dad and took over my lands, came the squeaking reply. I think he has my mom as his concubine, whatever that is. It sounds nice, but everyone says it isn't. So I need you to kill him, and then get me in charge. My uncle's got bunches of minions too. They're not nice at all. Arnold didn't bother asking how someone so young heard of the Dawn. Word had a way of getting around to those who were in the right sort of need and means. That second part was what brought him to the next question. All right. That should be pretty easy to do, honestly. But I have to ask, what can someone like you use for payment? There was a moment of thoughtful silence. You know those shiny rocks people like? How shiny? Like really, really shiny. Sometimes you can see through them. And they come out of underground. Diamonds? Sounds right. Anyway, I know where there are a pair of those holes they come from that were abandoned. You're offering us 2 diamond mines? If that's what they're called, yep. We'll get this sorted out in a week or so. Arnold waved to Harry as his boss left. Thanks, boss. Then he pressed a button on his desk. Kirkbane, you're on deck. Flight down to Africa, you're taking Ms. Kedward with you. He turned to the client. Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Simba. All 4 champions sat in the teacher's lounge. Well, 2 sat. Fleur and Harry spoke quietly. Despite her rage at his defilement, she could hardly object now that she could incinerate a dragon's head entirely. They were discussing how to hide the tattoos, with mixed results, as Harry had worked out the optimal placement and she was less than thrilled with it. Crum stood, arm resting on the fireplace mantel, staring at the last champion with an expression of mild disbelief. After a month and a half in her presence, it wasn't truly shocking, but it was still just so strange that he had trouble coming to terms with it. In this case it was the fact that girl Toby had managed to get her hands on a dessert, and was now bouncing around the room with her feet firmly side by side for reasons known only to her. She was doing this while jumping a pair of long ropes she had conjured, and was animating to create a double Dutch pattern. The judges filed into the room. With the addition of another champion, Dumbledore said, we've decided to add some more tasks. As a result of this, each of the other judges devised a new task which is certainly in no way related to the strengths of his or her champion. For this purpose, I turn the floor over to Mr. of the Red Sands. Thank you. Sasori settled himself into a crouch. This is a task that will be ongoing for the remainder of the tournament and stresses stealth, subtlety, and intelligence. Tomorrow morning, you will each receive a letter with a clue. This will lead you to your next clue and so on. The clues will eventually lead you to what you are to retrieve and bring to me. There will be a series of objectives over the course of the tournament. Sometimes you will be in competition for one prize, sometimes it becomes a matter of getting yours first. Is that understood? With 4 nods, he went on. Should the target's absence be noticed, that will be marked as a failure, so discretion is essential. This will be taking place exclusively off of Hogwarts grounds, so keep in mind that you will need to spend a good deal of time away from the school. While this might cause your schooling to suffer, it will certainly ensure a strong grounding in practical lessons that are more valuable than academics anyway. Oh yes, Professor Dumbledore asked me to remind you that you are not permitted to sabotage one another excepting when you are in direct competition. I think that covers the important parts. The rest will be for you to work out. I will be watching. When the judges had left, Fleur turned to Harry. Subtlety and stealth? How does that describe you at all? Harry shrugged. You didn't catch me tattooing you. Why are we way out in the forest, Uncle Sasori? Because it's important to meet your summons. I got that part. And your boss is huge. About that. Don't even try to tell me that Okong isn't a boss. No. He is. Harry looked rather sheepish. Then what? Well, it's a bit complicated. I don't have anywhere to be today. So, have you ever looked at a contract? I mean more than just checking the signatures or the type at the top. When Sasori shook his head, Harry continued, well, I did. A lot. They're really complicated. And if you know how to read them, they specify each and every entity that can be summoned by the signatory. Sort of. It's all pretty abstract, but when Dad's crows have a new chick, the contract needs to be slightly modified to add the new crow to the set. All right. That makes sense. Well, that means that when I made my own contract, I had to put in each of the beings I could summon, right? So, I did one of those chakra potency test things while I was home, and I was pretty much off the charts. The curse seal means I'm constantly running at full and using nature chakra at that. So, I'm not sure where you're going with this. Maybe I should just show you. Harry bit his thumb and slammed his hand down on the ground. The forest disappeared in a cloud. Sasori looked up when the smoke had dissipated. What in the name of all the blessed gods did you do, Harry? Surrounding them were 6 figures, each gargantuan in size. One was Okong, who looked around and seemed mildly disappointed that there wasn't another dragon to eat. There was also what could best be described as a mound of hair with armor. Careful observation would reveal that it was quadrupedal, but that was almost completely obscured first by a layer of thick, shaggy fur that dangled all the way to the ground, and more thoroughly by segmented layers of metal plates that covered nearly the entire thing with just the occasional bit of hair poking out from a joint. From what must be its head extended a long protuberance with its own flexible armored layers and a pair of giant tusks. Gleaming out of holes in the head armor were a pair of coal-red orbs. Beside that was a form that stood taller than the others, wearing a similar set of armor to Okong, though it didn't wear a hat. Coming off the ursine head was a massive topknot of coarse, brown hair, which also covered the arms under its bracers. The pair of swords at its side was complemented with a huge bow on its back, and a set of arrows on its left hip. Next was a huge, avian form, as best as could be seen under scale mail. It had a set of blades over the leading edges of its wings, which had some sort of heavy cloth with metal-ribbed reinforcements. Green eyes with slotted pupils stared out from under a metallic helm, and the caw it lost was enough to send the remaining acromantula running. Then came the third of the armored sword-wielders. This one had a long tail that slipped out from under its armored waistplates with black, pebbled hide. Both feet were uncovered, allowing long, dexterous digits to flex on the forest floor. Similarly long fingers flexed on its hands. Blue eyes stared out of a coldly reptilian face that had far too many teeth. Finally, a giant, brown-furred being wearing comparatively simple garb. It had on just a pair of loose pants and a GI. A short, narrow head swiveled around, examining the surroundings. What drew the eye, though, were the enormous claws extending from its paws. "Greetings, my lord," intoned Okong. "Let me introduce my fellows to your lordship." He pointed a finger at the armored mound. "This is Ovada." It made a motion that might have been a bow. Omiri, the ursine figure, clasped its paws in front of its chest and bowed. Ozai's, the bird, caught again, spitting fire into the air. Ojira, the reptile, gave a half bow. And Omapi, the last, gave a deep bow. I might have made a contract with just 6 bosses. Gamabunta stared up in shock at the armored ape, who somehow managed to be taller than him. Finding that there was someone physically larger was bad enough, but the giant was accompanied by another 5 equally imposing figures. Still, he was the boss toad for a reason. One hand went to the hilt of his blade. "Who the fuck are you lot?" Despite the volume, his accent was distinct and rough, sounding about as close to a street thug of Osaka as he could without speaking Japanese. It was especially glaring when considered against the cultured words of the ape. "This one apologizes most strongly for our unwanted visit." It wasn't just that he sounded more educated and polished, his words had an archaic ring to them that spoke of ancient formality. One large hand reached out and took hold of the giant lizard's wrist. "Peace, Ojira." "Fuck that noise." The lizard's growl was closer to Gamabunta's diction. The words were crude, though the accent was more of a farmer than a street tough. "He's rude." Gamabunta took a couple steps back. Not out of fear, and he felt it showed intelligence on his part. By doing so, he kept the sextet in his field of vision and, more importantly, at angles he could strike. That wasn't to say he didn't feel mildly intimidated, but he was the boss, and he wouldn't let fear rule him. Nevertheless, the ursine warrior sporting the topknot stepped closer to Ojira and laid a massive paw on its shoulder. "We arrived without warning. We are stronger than rudeness." If the ape sounded cultured, this one sounded outright posh country gentry to the ape's urbanity. "Apologies." When Bunta didn't respond, the bear sighed. "Your name, please?" "You first." Both ape and bear gripped the lizard tightly. "Apologies on apologies. This one is Okong." "Gamabunta. Why are you here?" "We are." The bear paused. "New around here? Or perhaps returning after a long rest?" The thing that looked like a mound of hair and armor rumbled something that Bunta was eventually able to decide had been Yo, but it was hard to tell. Even compared to the bass voices of any boss, it was a deep sound that was almost below audible range. "You looking for a rumble?" Bunta remained on edge. They hadn't done anything overtly threatening, but they were bigger than he was and half wore multiple swords. The others just came with weapons built in. Merely being good neighbors, the bear replied calmly as Okong managed to get a good grip on Ojira and began to drag him away. "Next time, we shall send word we intend to visit. We merely wish to meet our new neighbors." The 4 others turned and left. "The fuck just happened?" muttered Bunta. Chapter 88, Omake. Miss Granger. Despite his inclination toward stealth, Sasori had made sure to be thoroughly audible in his approach of the young woman. According to Hari, she was his first student in proper magic. When that was combined with training under his nephew for several years, he assumed that her reaction to being startled would be with violence, and while he was unlikely to end up having a problem there, it was still easier to avoid it. She turned around. With Hari teaching so much, she now had several classes she had to walk alone between. Any normal young woman would be worried about being alone in a deserted hallway surrounded by a school full of hormonal teenagers. Hermione was a student of Professor Potter and so would be willing to eviscerate anyone so terminally stupid. Besides, everyone here was also a student of Professor Potter and knew how he felt about that kind of behavior. Yes, Mr. Sasori will do. I just have an accolade, no surname. Right. What can I do for you, Mr. Sasori? With her hesitation gone, she reverted to the less formal, less pronounced version of the prefix. I require your help. Oh? Yes. I need to understand how to use what I believe is called a train dot. Arnold Lewis walked into his office and immediately drew his wand. There was someone in the stacks other than his staff. They wouldn't be downstairs from their rooms for another hour yet. In the file room was a young man with red hair. Who the fuck are you? Snapped Arnold, silently flinging a binding hex. When the figure dodged, it drew his eye to the cloak over his shoulders. And you must be some kind of idiot to break in here pretending to be a member of the Dawn. He snapped his wand down, launching a series of non-lethal curses. Professor Potter was usually of the opinion that killing was the only valid option, but he had reviewed the need to capture persons of interest. This bastard definitely qualified. Pretending? I assure you, I am not. Arnold was forced to duck out of the way of a trio of knives that flicked out from under the sleeves of his cloak. Perhaps I should introduce myself? My name is. He deflected a conjured chain with a knife. Sasori of the Red Sand. Arnold stopped in the middle of another spell. Oh. That's different. He tucked his wand away. You look much younger than I expected. The odds of anyone threatening knowing who Professor Potter's relatives were was remarkably low. He paused. It's so cool to meet you, you know. Oh. I've been managing our intelligence network pretty much on my own these days. That's on top of running the office, so I'm sure I'm missing things. Could you, maybe, take a look and let me know what you think? Sasori gestured to the cabinet he'd been going through. That's what I was doing. Oh yeah? I guess you could do that. But using the computer is so much easier. The redhead paused. I don't think I know how to do that. Come on, you can use mine. Arnold was already conjuring a chair beside his at his desk. We've got a lot of agents, so I have 3 people helping by taking the incoming data and sorting it so I at least have it in some kind of order when I try to work it out. Sasori, with a lot of help, opened the list of active agents. If he'd been able to, he would have blanched. Harry had managed to establish a network larger than his own in only a few years. He didn't know what all the titles and notes next to the names meant, something he'd be discussing with the young man who apparently ran the whole operation, but even if half of them were worthless, it was still huge for so little time. Impressive. His voice was calm thanks to being entirely artificial. I can see why it takes you some time. I've got nothing on the schedule this morning, so barring a walk-in, I can take the time and show you how to use one of the computers in the stacks. Sasori's smile was hungry. All right. It was a couple hours later that the boss's phoenix flared into being in front of Arnold and dropped a letter on the keyboard he and Sasori were working over. Sasori chuckled to himself as he saw the Hogwarts seal on it. Well, well. It appears my nephew may be maturing a little after all. He's smart enough to delegate to you. Do you mind if I open it? Go ahead. I'll finish going through the current reports from the London PD. Arnold skimmed the contents, then reread them several times. Well then. He frowned and then considered his possible options and shuddered. There really was only one team he could send on this, whether it required pulling them from the duty roster or not. First though, he'd get the 3 in the stacks to make sure he sent the pair to the right place. Michelson. A young man in crisp slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up materialized from the depths of the stacks. Yes? He had a distinctly put-together look that suggested he came out of a Muggle university rather than magical education. He also clearly didn't have a wand. Arnold hadn't even considered objecting to hiring people who knew how to use a computer for this job, especially since one of them had a degree in library science, who knew that people got special training to be librarians. This is top priority. Get the details sorted out, and then pass the marching orders to Kirk Bain. Tell Matthew's vacation is called early, and he's headed to Africa to relieve Kirk Bain. Got it. The man disappeared into the shadows that defied the lights overhead. Sorry about that, Mr. Sasori. But when the boss sends me something directly, I understand. You'll want to work quickly. That might just be a timed task. Isaac huffed the partly transparent spirit. We've cleansed the place completely. Why are we still here? Because we're supposed to have him on the throne. She looked at the stone the cub sat on. Close enough. I want to get out of here. He's not really fit to rule. Arms crossed under an ample bust. So what? So I think we should make sure to deal with it. A vulture winged down to land so that Isaac was between it and the woman. Huh. He opened the envelope on its leg. Looks like we're being recalled early. Thank the creatures from beyond. He scribbled a few quick lines on the back of the letter and handed it to the vulture. Vulture. There. Now it's the problem of whoever covers for us. Now, you'll see that the behavior of the spotted hyena is. The professor trailed off, seeing two young men standing at the door of his classroom. Professor Niles George? Why, yes. They weren't very old or very broad and were wearing jeans and t-shirts, but there was something vaguely menacing about them nevertheless. You need to come with us. Professor George had always wanted to believe that he was the kind of person who, when the situation called for it, would fight back rather than allow someone to do horrible things to him. It wasn't any fun to learn that he'd been wrong, and he was the type who would quietly acquiesce in the hopes that it wouldn't end badly. His class, in turn, were watching with confusion. The two couldn't be any older than them, possibly younger, even, but they weren't very safe. He really hoped this wasn't the last anyone would see him alive. Hello, Professor Dieter. The voice wasn't cruel, or even not kind. In fact, it was nearly friendly. However, it was next to his ear while he was in his bed. And he lived alone. Terribly sorry to wake you, but you have to come with me. What? He sat up to see three people in his room. Two of them were the age of university students. The third had the tweedy look of someone who spent his life in study. What's going on? This is a kidnapping. He wasn't sure what there was to say after that. You know, said Professor Dieter to the man who'd been introduced as Professor George. When they said they were kidnapping me, I rather expected to be shoved in the boot of a car and then taken to some horrible building in Limehouse or Whitechapel. This, not so much. Professor George looked around the spacious cabin of the private jet they'd been escorted to by their captors. It had been a comfortable drive in the SUV to the airport, and then this. There was even alcohol. He had to agree, when he was kidnapped, he'd been fearing the worst. Now, though, he was just confused. A 2-hour drive through some of the most untamed country Professor George had ever seen was actually something of a delight. He'd never had the chance to travel to the parts of the globe he specialized in. But on the other hand, this was nowhere near anything resembling civilization. The plane had landed in a field of brush, for goodness' sake. As such, he just had to ask. Not to be rude, gentlemen, it was always wise to be polite to kidnappers, but can I ask where we are or going, preferably both? Well, said the shorter of the two. I couldn't tell you exactly where, but we're definitely in Africa. We're headed to our client's home. Someone lives out here? Demanded Professor Dieter. So, where's this client? Despite the length of the drive, it had been remarkably smooth. The terrain must have been a lot less irregular than it looked. Professor George was staring at the cutest lion cub he'd ever seen. Right up until it opened its mouth. I'm right here, mister. Gah. The two professors jumped in shock. Neither noticed their kidnappers being slightly surprised as well. Holy shit. A talking lion. Hey. I don't make remarks about a talking human. So, profs, you two are here to teach this young lad how to rule. We're what? So, can you tell me the area of your domain? Asked Professor Dieter. Everything the light touches, my dad said. Came the chipper reply. This was going to be an uphill struggle. When you get older, you're going to want to mate with all the females in your pride, Professor George said. Ick. Why? That's what moms and dads do. Yes. Well, sooner or later, you're going to want to be a dad yourself. If I have to, the cub looked rather unhappy. I guess Nala isn't so bad for a girl. About that, you're not going to want to mate with just Nala, it'll be all of the females. You shouldn't worry about that. It's perfectly natural. It's also okay if you decide to kill any male lion who comes into your territory. Hey! I've been trying to teach him how to be diplomatic. Professor Dieter seemed rather put out over this new revelation. Dad never killed anyone. Neither did his dad. Simba paused. Uncle Scar did, but he was mean. Dad should have killed him. Dieter sighed. It was true that sometimes people needed killing. And, well, he was a lion. Lions had to kill to eat as any carnivore did. But at least the kid was listening to the ideas of how taxation worked. Simba, Professor George said carefully, you said your father ran this pride? Yup. Just like his dad did. And my dad's dad, too. The professor sat down heavily on a rock. That's fucked up. That means Nala is at best your cousin by Scar and at worst your sister. It depends on who her mom was. There were only 2 males in the pride. He rubbed his face with a hand. This isn't. How come there aren't other cubs around? Clearly inbreeding isn't an issue around here, but without more cubs. The other lionesses are no good, Prof? Asked one of the young men. Aside from the fact that they're his aunts? They're reaching the end of their fertility. All he'll have are immature cubs, assuming that he matures fast enough to make use of their remaining time. That's no good. So, he needs birds his own age. Pretty much. Not a problem. Hey, Simba, you know of anything else valuable around here? Here? Arnold opened the invoice and blinked. Why on earth? He glanced at the morning's paper. Well, that explained mysterious kidnappings. Lioness cubs vanish from zoos across world. There was going to have to be a really good explanation for this one. Chapter 89. You will have fun, citizen. Good morning, stupids. Dumbledore paused for a moment, his mouth moving silently. I do believe that came out right. It is my great pleasure to announce that this year, for reasons, we are holding a Yule Ball. There was confused silence. The Yule Ball is a fancy dance you are obligated to attend if you are in 4th year or older. With a date. Persons attending stag or doe will find that remains their permanent state of relationship. In keeping with the name, it will be held the night of the winter solstice, which should give you almost 2 weeks to prepare. I'm sure that Hogsmeade has not raised the prices on dress robes in response to your inability to go to London to buy them. But if they have, then it's your fault for not knowing in advance that you would need them. I reiterate, you will have a date or forfeit dating for the remainder of your sorry time on this earth. Alcohol is strictly forbidden at this event. I will thank Messrs. Weasley to please hide the booze they sneak into the punch. Since you will all be stone-cold drunk, I want to leave you with a thought that should keep you nicely aware of yourself. Should anyone manage to engage in some impregnating activities, the brief period left for your life will be spent in the most horrific experiences I can concoct, with all the deviousness of a man who has a dungeon in his house. After that, breakfast resumed with its usual vigor. There was an undercurrent of concern throughout the castle. Boys were asking girls out desperately, trying to make sure they didn't suffer whatever punishment Dumbledore decided to inflict. Several secret couples were having to make plans to change that status. The number of injuries in Professor Potter's classes rose dramatically as distracted students failed to dodge properly, and then received a second wound for their fuck-up, the professor's words. Harry. Fleur was once again sitting beside him. She had a high tolerance for the strangeness that surrounded him. As odd as it is for me to be doing this, and although I'm sure of your answer, would you go to the Yule Ball with me? Nope. I've got a date. Fleur grinned. Several boys were suddenly very distracted. Impressive. How'd you manage to get a date in 2 days? She didn't look up at the young men who had begun to surround her. No, I won't go with any of you pathetic wastes of sperm. If you don't go away, I will crisp the lot of you. I wrote a letter. It was pretty easy, honestly. The rest of the table was less shocked by the interaction. Fleur had taken to trying to get rejected by Harry on occasion because she enjoyed the novel experience. He'd begun to take it in stride. Compared to his uncles, this was nothing. And as he'd told her, she was very pretty, but not enough to lose his mind over. He also reminded her that he was able to say this despite having seen her nude and actually touched her body to tattoo her. That part usually left her a bit livid, but impressed all the same. Well then, this is a little more difficult. You're right, said Crum, who seemed to have a highly developed death wish. After all, who'd want to go with your skinny ass? Millie pulled him out of the way of the fireball that set part of the Hufflepuff table on fire. Mr. Crum, I understand that you a guest in my castle, but I must nevertheless insist that you try to minimize your attempts to provoke Mademoiselle Delacour. It's damaging my stuff. Dumbledore hadn't looked up during the exchange, but the sound of air igniting was distinctive and few people in the castle, even with Professor Potter's instruction, were as quick to anger and as quick to fiery violence as the French witch. The Hufflepuffs were busily containing the blaze that had consumed half the giant table, and was now making a spirited go of melting through the floor. Girl Toby contributed by pulling marshmallows from somewhere and roasting them. Have either of you made any progress on Mr. Sassery's task? Crum asked when Fleur had stopped holding fire in her hands. Yep. I have had some success. Huh. Crum didn't comment on the fact that neither had left the school. Harry had skimmed the Times in Hermione's hands and picked up the hints that someone in his office had been at work. A minor pickpocketing incident in King's Cross with unspecified losses, and a series of random break-ins at a couple of upscale hotels. Those had been responses to the first clue. After this, though, he had no idea what to look for. Most of it wouldn't even make the papers. Hogsmeade was remarkably understanding about the need for dress robes and only tripled their prices, knowing that students of Professor Harry tended, mostly, to be rather law-abiding. There were the outliers, of course, but stealing dress robes was a messy affair, because few of those students also had any talent at the kind of detailed charm work needed to modify them to fit properly. It was a rather basic anti-theft method that all smart magical tailors used. They never made self-fitting or otherwise altering clothing and jealously guarded their techniques for customizing the cloth. Between that and making it a point to never alter one another's clothing to keep everyone honest, merchandise tended to stay where it was supposed to. That didn't mean that it was a peaceful town during the only weekend students were allowed there before the ball. It was a week before they had to have dates and people were scrambling to secure last-minute company. The only saving grace was that since everyone needed a date, everyone was pretty much certain to get a date. The question was with whom. There was also a good deal of vicious fighting to see who got first pick of the dress robes, with several prompted duels breaking out in the middle of the town, officiated by the head girl, who corralled other students and generally made sure that there weren't injured bystanders, that sent a few students to the hospital wing in mortal terror of what Professor Potter was going to do to punish them. The third years bought candy and watched the chaos with every sign of enjoyment. The smarter ones were taking note of techniques used by their upperclassmen because Professor Potter was very big on self-improvement. More than one placed bet that Draco Malfoy, having secured a date with Tracy via the most ancient and strange of methods, asking nicely, was handling with the aplomb of someone who'd been raised to see profit everywhere and the skill of avoiding danger that being around Professor Harry had instilled. Girl Toby, being the only third year who needed to attend the ball, had acquired dress robes from somewhere during the previous week. To keep herself occupied, she had grabbed a set of the nicest dress robes from a shop and proceeded to run off down the street with them, chased by a group of irate would-be buyers and cackling as she dodged their spellfire. That she replied with only prank spells was far from kind, and in her wake was a trail of thoroughly tickled, leg-locked, jelly-legged, and stung students. The brothers Weasley, aware of their horrid robes, courtesy of their well-meaning mother, were on the prowl for bargain options and had begun contemplating going in school robes since they were a nice, plain black at least. For some reason, their mother, despite having their exact coloration, persisted in buying maroon clothing for them. At one time, they would have consulted with their little sister, but since her possession, Tam's ability to judge matters like this had pretty much vanished, and she rarely wore anything but simple blacks, whites and grays. Their dates, Ron was still looking for his, but there was a good chance he'd find someone in time since everyone had been of some assistance in the matter and accompanied them on the expedition, declaring that none of the robes they could reasonably afford were worth the price. Tam herself, being a theoretical third year, according to any official documentation, at least, wasn't invited to the ball, so had a great deal of amusement at the antics of the upperclassmen. She did take the time to send an anonymous letter via Al from Hogsmeade. Professor Potter was nominally acting as chaperone for the students. In practice, that meant that he reminded them not to break any rules and then disappeared in a cloud of fire. It wasn't a long trip, but he'd needed to get some supplies for a last-minute project, do a bit of research, and get a gift for someone who'd turned up rather unexpectedly. He didn't have time to make something on such short notice. After that, he walked the streets, deducting points from anyone who hadn't escaped from Girl Toby's various hexes and admonishing both sides of the ongoing duel for their failures. The people of the village weren't terribly thrilled about the fact that the escort wasn't doing anything to stop the eruption of violence that was filling their streets, but were also aware that this was Professor Potter, and decided that him not ordering their homes burned to the ground was about as good as they were going to get. Besides, several students who secured robes had begun to help protect buildings and repair damage done during the festivities. The rare merchant willing to brave the streets made a good profit refreshing the concessions of the audience for the various fights. It occurred to Harry that evening that he could have just mailed a request to Arnold, and had all the things he'd done that day dealt with, but there was something satisfying about going out into the field. Besides, he was still getting used to having people to handle problems for him. The fact that he'd turned over Uncle Sassery's task had been more a function of needing to be in the castle to teach than anything. He'd considered sending clones out, but they had limited lifetimes, and this was a series of missions with unknown durations. He needed to stop by the office come summer, though, so he could get caught up on what all was happening. His young lieutenant seemed to be a resourceful administrator, but the reports he was getting showed that his organization had expanded beyond his personal hires, and it might be wise to meet the new employees. "Well, we've come to the day of reckoning," was how Dumbledore's morning address began. "It's tonight that we find out if everyone made sure to have a date. I'm rather torn, really, because I almost want someone to be stupid enough to give me a reason to inflict punishments, but that would come at the cost of someone making me look bad. On the whole of it, I think it best if you obey me. Classes will be ending at noon today, so that those of you who are of a female persuasion can take the truly epic lengths of time you require for primping and powdering and whatever else it is you do. All males who are attending the ball are to take that time to report to Madame Pomfrey for contraceptive potions to make absolutely sure that the punch that will be alcohol-free does not result in intoxicated impregnations. The doors to the Great Hall will open at precisely 6 in the evening. I expect that all of you will want to be waiting for that momentous event, because the idea of fashionably late is one that I never, personally, encountered, and tardiness is rather insulting towards me, something I'm sure you all wish to avoid at the risk of being dangled by your thumbs from the astronomy tower. Thank you." Arnold looked over his spreadsheets. If Muggles had one thing to be said for them, it would be the ability to keep track of data without having to make a new spell each time. In this case, it was the subscription lists for the various newsletters published by the Dawn. He'd broken the country down into districts based on the Muggle parliamentary districts and separate sheets for government offices. As distance from Britain grew, so did the breadth of the district. At least until he had a chance to spread agents more thoroughly on the continent and beyond. the readership of their distribution was remarkably sparse. This was partly because the Dawn did not advertise the service per se. He'd simply decided that it was easier to prepare the things monthly to send to those who were paying them for regular reports. The other reason was that Arnold, despite being the effective boss of a group of nearly amoral killers, thieves, and kidnappers, was not stupid enough to give the kinds of information the Dawn collected to just anyone. Before anyone was allowed to subscribe, they were subjected to a week-long investigation by the Dawn to make sure that it wouldn't end badly. Of course, the price was also exorbitant. Those who paid on a per-issue basis were pretty safe, but those who were on a monthly subscription and missed their payments, well, they'd been publishing them for a little while now, and a couple of people had managed to be that stupid or careless. The vetting process was mostly about whether the person could be safely given the information, not that the Dawn shared everything that they got. The ones who hadn't paid, well, the Dawn sent a few agents to collect an interest. And one hadn't had enough for that. Arnold had needed to find a way to make up that loss, so he'd had the man rendered for potions ingredients. His potion maker turned the results into organ regrowth potions with truly insane prices because they were highly illegal to make in Britain and most of the Western world, and good bits of the rest of it as well. Pretty much anywhere that tried to put value on the life of humans. Still, despite having a number of monthly subscribers, he could count on his fingers. They were highly profitable and required no agents to do anything other than what he had them doing anyway. As far as Arnold was concerned, this was essentially free money. It would surprise many who'd been cleared for subscribing and who hadn't. And then there was the boss's project. It was keeping his top team out of play for an unspecified length of time without bringing in money. If the company weren't making truly absurd amounts of money, that would have been an issue. It was frustrating though. Kedway was pretty much a panacea for any matter he was presented with. He still wasn't sure what that little doll was for. He knew he'd end up having to find out at some point, but he wished to prolong his ignorance. Still, it was time for another talk with Gormchev, so he could learn a bit more about the people he was now hiring in small numbers to engage in research under the man's instruction and occasionally go out and solve a problem or two. Chapter 90, Harry's Date Is. The staff hadn't been idle during the time allotted to students for preparations. With the exception of Professor Potter, whose skill wasn't in doubt, but who none of the staff wished to involve for fear he'd try to help, they had been hard at work setting up the Great Hall. Gone were the normal tables, replaced with dozens of smaller tables, able to sit two, and a handful of tables that groups of friends could commandeer. A platform had been set up to one side, draped with bunting on which a series of instruments were being tuned by their owners. The Weird Sisters had been unable to perform due to pressing engagements, but Dumbledore had managed to book a rising band One Direction. The three bagpipers were engaged in a spirited war behind the silencing charms to see who could be on key the loudest. They used somewhat old-fashioned versions, with pipes taller than they were and supported by magic. The drummer had replaced the heads of his drums for the event, and was carefully adjusting their tension via the time-honored technique of grabbing a roadie by the hair and smacking his face against the skin in question. The six violinists were actually fighting a duel over the first chair, and ignoring the pair of cellists, who were trying to get them to sit down and actually prepare for the gig. There had been some struggle to move the massive organ into the hall. Hundreds of pipes stretched up to the enchanted ceiling, each one labeled with increasingly unusual titles: B, G-flat, Y-sharp, male voice, castrati, laugh track, car accident, and so on. The organist was limbering up, stretching his fingers and placing them over the vast banks of keys that surrounded him completely to the point that he was entirely hidden from view. Professor McGonagall had confided in Dumbledore that she'd received an unsigned letter asking her to the ball. Her first instinct had been to go neuter Sirius Black, but since the phrasing had been polite, she assumed it couldn't be him. She was more than a little surprised at it, actually. Despite her physical attributes, she had managed to quell any and all interest in her taking the role of Mrs. Robinson until now. At this point, she mostly wanted to know which of her students had written so charming a note. The castle was abuzz with excitement. People wanted to know whom Professor Potter had brought as a date. Students had met their dates and slipped into the hall to take their seats. The champions were supposed to make a grand entrance after everyone was present, so they were gathered in an alcove off to the side to wait for their cue, being overseen by McGonagall, who was spending most of her time being incredibly surprised by the pairs in front of her. Virtually every male student had to stop for a moment when they saw the deputy headmistress. In honor of it being a dance, she had done her best to dress formally, but there was only so much she could do with the enchantments in effect. At least she'd been able to give the house colors an airing. The fact that she was becoming somewhat used to this was worrying. Her hair hung loose, which at least covered some of her back. She hadn't been able to get it down to a full dress. She wore what could be considered slightly more covering than a bra made of dark red fabric with gold lace edging that had tiny lions worked into the pattern. It had been a consistent problem that, with the exception of certain blouses, she was unable to cover her midriff, so it was, once again, bared. The only bright spot there was that she was somehow still warm, despite the freezing temperatures around her. Her skirt was probably the worst part though. It was so low on her hips that she'd had to forego underwear to not have it peeking out over the waist. That had been bad enough, but while the fabric swept the floor in its length, it was slid up the front almost all the way so that it billowed around her, looking more like a cape than proper clothing and showing a lot of leg and feet in red heels. She wasn't sure how she'd managed it, but the slice up the front was just enough that she wasn't flashing anyone as long as she kept her legs crossed while sitting. McGonagall hadn't been surprised to find Millicent Bulstrode was attending the ball with Crum. She had managed to find a dress that was, if not flattering. Professor McGonagall tried not to think badly of her students, but she had to admit that young Miss Bulstrode was not gifted with great beauty, then at least was acceptable and wouldn't have people throwing things. On the other hand, she had certainly not expected Mademoiselle Delacour to attend with Miss Girl-Toby on her arm. The young girl was wearing a black dress that was appropriately conservative for her age, though the black with red clouds was more than a little worrying. The French champion wore an even more conservative outfit, denying all the British beliefs about French women, or just covering all tattooed skin. Professor Potter stood alone. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly, "we are coming to the time when the champions must enter the ball. Where is your date?" She said something about finishing touches to her makeup. She hadn't been wearing any when we met up, so I don't see why she'd want some now. He shrugged. "I don't claim to understand how females deal with formal occasions. My aunt never went to them." "Well, she needs to be here soon." Then a voice spoke from behind her. Well, Minerva. Look at you all slut up for the dance." McGonagall's face went from stern to stony in an instant. The black tail that had been curled around her thigh bristled, and the ears on the top of her head flattened back into her hair. She slowly turned to face the source of the insult. Circe, her tone was sickly sweet behind gritted teeth. "How nice to see you, Naya." The last sound out of her mouth made her expression grow positively feral for a second before smoothing into the icy politeness of a woman talking to someone who'd picked on her throughout her school years. "Isn't it just?" The woman smiled broadly, ignoring the obvious warning signs with either blithe stupidity or supreme confidence. "I wasn't expecting to see so much of you though, Minerva." McGonagall inhaled a hissing breath. "And she waved her hands to encompass McGonagall's body. "Such a vain thing, aren't you, Minerva? Were you aging so badly that you had to retreat behind your youth? What are you doing here?" McGonagall nearly growled. "Didn't you know?" Circe laid a hand on Harry's forearm. "I'm his date." McGonagall winced as her claws extended into her balled-up fists. Presenting. Lee Jordan had somehow taken it upon himself to introduce the champions without any preparation or, indeed, prompting. There was a hurried discussion between several of the staff over whether to stop him. The champions. Victor Crum and Millicent Bulstrode. The pair entered through the double doors and walked slowly towards the staff table where the champions were to eat. No one was entirely clear on why. It was a mark of human nature's capacity for adaptation that no one in the hall seemed particularly drawn to staring at Professor McGonagall, despite her revealing outfit. Instead, they were looking at the unlikely couple who had just entered. "Here come Mademoiselle Delacour and Miss Girl Toby." There was relative quiet when the two entered. A small sigh of disappointment came from those who'd hoped that Fleur would wear something that flashed some skin, instead of her recent trend towards excessively modest clothes. "I'm not sure how those two ended up together, but it should be an interesting dance at least. And now, Professor Potter and YOWZA." Jordan broke from his task to gape at the woman who had accompanied his instructor. Circe wasn't all that tall, a few inches taller than Harry, who still had a fair bit of growing to do, but she carried herself with the supreme confidence of a woman who knew the world was hers to play with as she liked. Her features weren't quite delicate or fine, but her cheekbones were high and stood out strongly enough. Her eyes were dark brown, darker than her tan skin that spoke of ancestry on the Mediterranean. Cascades of black hair that was somehow unruly, and yet carefully coiffed, tumbled down behind her. There was a study in contrasts going on between herself and the pale McGonagall, who was only a few feet away. Where McGonagall was built sturdily, with a massive chest, Circe was nearly well blessed. Her figure was more classically beautiful as well, a narrow waist that flared out to impressively curved hips, and onto legs that stretched far longer than seemed right. Where McGonagall's outfit covered as much as possible while under her heias, Circe's dress flaunted her beauty. The dress was a sky blue, but only on a technicality, since it was also a diaphanous fabric that was almost transparent, leaving more of a haze over her despite clinging to her form. The entire outfit was smoking almost literally, slow, whitish clouds puffed off of the garment. It managed to maintain the absolute minimum of modesty, with much of her breasts covered by white light that seemed to form within the cloth, rather than be the fabric itself. A similarly shaded band that wrapped around her hips, hiding from view that which was considered intolerable in polite company. Despite that, her body was heavily on display, showing the lean lines and the slightest hint of a stomach that made the lines of her pelvis more heavily defined by comparison. Sapphires winked at her earlobes. A large star sapphire dangled from a delicate chain, resting comfortably between her breasts, thanks to the low cut of the bodice that revealed almost as much as it could. Her smile was even and white, and had a hungry edge to it that any student of Professor Potter was bound to note. The biggest difference between her and McGonagall was in carriage, though. McGonagall seemed almost ashamed of her physical beauty, or, at least, uncomfortable with it. Circe clearly exulted in it. Her expression was one of someone luxuriating in attention. Beside her, Professor Potter was dressed in moderately unusual fashion. He wore a white tuxedo, although the jacket was cut to end at his calves. In a way, it was more understated than usual, lacking his Akatsuki robe, but it was all the more noteworthy because of that oddity. Ahem. Lee Jordan took a few deep breaths, getting his brain back under control. Thankfully, he'd had months of exposure to Professor McGonagall's new look and even all of November to get used to a demi-human with only partial control over her magical attraction. It still took a bit of work. Accompanying Professor Potter is MOM? Blaze's voice rang through the entire hall. Lee Jordan was stymied again. "Holy hell, Blaze," murmured Tam. "Your mom is Circe Helios? She was the meanest cocktease in Slytherin." "What?" "I believe it's Circe Zabini, mother of Hogwarts' own Blaze Zabini. The story of how this happened should be interesting. And I bet there will be a distinct lack of idle speculation on how this came to be, since no one would want to offend Professor Potter." The pair followed the others to the high table. Fleur observed with a certain amount of smugness that Harry was as unaffected by the overt sensuality that Circe was throwing around as he was by her own nature. Mostly, she was glad that it meant she wasn't experiencing some sort of weakening of her abilities. The rest of the student body, on the other hand, the training of Professor McGonagall had been utterly insufficient when working against the actively seductive behavior on display. It took until Circe had taken a seat before the observers snapped out of their fugue, mostly because of their terror that Adjunct Professor Moody would punish them for lack of vigilance. Thankfully, he was staring as well and proceeded to use a suite of anti-charm spells on himself the moment he was able to focus. Dumbledore rose to his feet and held out his hands. He had dressed more formally than usual, wearing a rather stern dress and pearls. "Thank you for showing up and not making me punish you. I welcome my former student back to the castle, and remind her that while my students are the same age as they always are, she is much older than them, and should please keep that in mind. Now that we have that formality out of the way, let's get on to the main event, food. Despite this being a ball, and having set aside a good portion of the night for dancing, I am well aware that the most important aspect of the celebration is the meal, hence my delaying it as long as I can think of things to say." He grinned at a sea of students who seemed completely unfazed by this announcement and frowned. Perhaps he had inured them to this too soon? He was silent for almost a minute as he considered the matter. "How odd. I think I'm out of things to say." "Well then." He sat down. Moments later, he sprang up again. "I have it. I'm sure you're wondering how your food will get to you, yes? From the kitchens?" called Gred. "Indeed, Mr. Weasley, and, incidentally, 6 points from Gryffindor for that helpful tidbit. Did I forget that tonight is special? I guess I did. Tonight is special. Instead of having whatever the elves are making and whatever Professor Potter has requested, we will be having individually made-to-order food. That has the foreseen side effect of slowing the meal down, because the elves are making everything from scratch. I think I've gotten off topic. Wait, no, I just deviated slightly. You will order your food like this." He returned to his seat, leaned down until his face was pressed against the empty space where plates would normally be, and shouted, "Pork chop, medium. Side of mash and green beans. Also, goblet of fire whiskey from Snape's supply." The purple tablecloth did little to mute the sound of the headmaster's voice. The hall quickly turned into a cacophony as everyone rushed to order their food before anyone else, so they'd get their food first. Professor Potter picked up the small bowl of white rice that appeared in front of him, plucked a pair of wooden chopsticks from his sleeve and began to eat with an expression of interest as he observed the chaos. Draco Malfoy put a hand on Tracy's arm as she leaned down. "Don't bother." From his pocket, he pulled a brown paper bag. He set it on the table and withdrew 2 plates already prepared with chops, chicken, a bit of salad, and not a hint of potato. At Tracy's questioning glance, he shrugged. "I may have had a feeling that if I wanted to eat in a timely manner tonight, that I would be best served by arranging matters ahead of time." "You're even being cagey about this?" Her tone was incredulous. "I am my father's son. No Malfoy admits anything if it's not necessary. And in all honesty, I'm my mother's son as well, and the Blacks don't even admit things when it is necessary. They lie preemptively. I'm of the opinion that since the family is technically down to 1 member, not counting offspring of women married out of it, that their plan isn't the wisest. Oh, and that member managed to spend a decade in prison on a wrongful charge. Really not impressed at the moment. 2 plates. Well, I do have a date, Tracy. It would be churlish of me to get myself dinner and not provide for you. Seriously, it's like you guys think that just because Malfoys tend to be manipulative sons of bitches that we don't know how to behave in proper society. My mother raised me to be a gentleman." He looked at their faces. "Really? Come on." "Sure, I was a prick in my first year. And my second year. Just because I acted like a complete jackass doesn't mean I don't know how to behave." He glowered at them. "Actually," Tracy said, a small smile gracing her lips, "I was more asking about why it was only 2 plates instead of enough for everyone in our little circle." "Oh." Malfoy stared at her for several moments. "Do you know, it never occurred to me." He paused. "Besides, I didn't know what the seating was going to be like, so I couldn't know how many people I'd be needing to feed even if I had thought of it." "And do you really care if your dates get fed?" The question was directed at Daphne and Pansy. Daphne had come with a third-year Ravenclaw who looked like he wasn't sure if he was incredibly lucky to be going out with a pretty, older girl, or if he was going to die for doing something wrong. Daphne felt he was doing pretty well at not actually crying. Unlike Pansy's date. Pansy had simply walked up to a first-year Slytherin, shoved her gun in his face, and informed him that he would be going to the ball as her date, and that if his hands did anything even slightly questionable, she'd make sure his parents got his body back over the course of months. The poor boy was sitting on his hands, and had tears running down his face. In deference to Pansy's, normally, bad mood, he was keeping the sobs quiet. "Not really," Pansy said. Daphne shrugged. "I care if my date eats," Blaise said. He was pointedly not looking at the head table, and Hermione had a hand pinning his wrist to the table. Especially since if she does, maybe I'll be able to get free and kill Potter for defiling my mother. The first time he'd said something like that, the table had responded with admonishments not to do something stupid like that and to keep his voice down. By now, they just treated it as background noise. Hermione patted his hand. "I doubt Harry is defiling her, Blaise." "Not for lack of trying on her part," murmured Draco, dodging to the side as a knife whipped at him from beside Blaise. "Please refrain from throwing the cutlery, you'll need it for eating soon." He smirked. "Probably." Inoichi frowned as he observed his best friend's son. Even more than his daughter, the young man was not taking things well. He'd just thrown himself into training hard. Shikamaru was racing about a clearing in the Nara forest. His legs were lost from the knee down in inky blackness that lashed around in tendrils about him and slithered along the ground while he threw kunai and shuriken, dodging and parrying with the kunai in his left hand. The cigarette in his mouth glowed brightly, and the smoke he exhaled was an ashen cloud filled with flickering embers. "He's been like this every day," Shikako murmured beside Inoichi. "Wakes up early in the morning and goes straight to training until he collapses, then he eats a bit and goes right back to it. If Ino and Choji come by, they get dragged into various scenarios that he drills them on until he's satisfied." "I see." The cloud this time flowed across the clearing and then exploded in a gout of fire. Shikamaru was holding one hand in the last seal of the family technique sequences, maintaining the shadow exercise at a level well beyond what was required and even necessarily useful as he forced himself to go well past the point of exhaustion, his chakra nearly drained as much as his body. "He's going through explosive tags like candy too," Shikako said. "I don't even know where he's getting all of them. Some of them are definitely not regulation tags. Larger yield for one thing. The only one who can keep up with his idea of training is Naruto, and that doesn't really count." "I'm not sure what I can do really," Inoichi admitted. "Excessive training in response to trauma is pretty much within the expected parameters for a ninja. Even if I'd never have thought Shikamaru was one to cope that way. And it's not like seeking revenge is outside our job description either. Part and parcel with our life, my friend. Just see if you can get through to him at all. If he burns himself out, he'll never manage to get the revenge he's so desperate for." Chapter 91, We're Back. Dumbledore watched with mild amusement as one of his former students draped herself over one of his current students, although that was always a bit of a question, considering his guest lecturer status. He'd have been more worried about the whole thing if Professor Potter had given Ms. Zabini much notice. He was carrying on a conversation with Fleur Delacour, apparently unaware of the attractive woman playing with the cardinal red shock of hair on his head. He would probably need to step in at some point to deal with it anyway, but for now. "I'm telling you no." Fleur growled. "I have enough comments in my life already. I do not need more of them. It's that or nothing." Harry insisted. "It's the only spot left. I haven't had time to experiment with other methods, and Professor McGonagall made it clear that I shouldn't put soul enchantments on clothing." "Why would you care?" asked Crum. "It's not like it could make you any less attractive." He blinked when he realized that no fireball had come at his face. "Are you feeling all right?" Yes, Fleur waved a hand dismissively. "But I've realized you're suffering from brain damage after too many bludger hits. It's wrong to attack the mentally infirm." Somehow, girl Toby produced a ham that was dripping in honey glaze, and was carving sections of it off for herself as food slowly began to fill various plates in the hall without any apparent pattern. There was a certain fascination in watching slice after slice somehow vanish, and the sounds of chewing, despite the mask not leaving her face. Does anyone know why Tam is hovering near the table? Millie gestured at the redhead who was hanging around behind McGonagall's seat. I asked her if she had a date and she said yes, replied Dumbledore. That reminds me, Minerva, Circe's eyes had a wicked gleam and her smile was just on the cusp of cruel. Whatever happened to that young man you used to date? McGonagall's face went stony. Tom Riddle, right? Such a charmer he was. Circe watched the stone visage somehow grow colder still. He never danced to my tune though. I always wondered what he saw in a little goody-good like you though. Now McGonagall's face had a dark scowl. Did he finally get tired of you and give the old heave-ho? No. The word came out as a harsh roar. Definitely dumped. Circe nodded to herself and gave McGonagall a once-over. I bet you could get him back now if you wanted. I mean, he must have seen something in you. And they always say it's the quiet ones. She didn't blink as Harry's chopsticks intercepted the raking claws on McGonagall's right hand as she tried to dig them into Circe's face. Wow. Must have been a bad breakup then. He was evil. Worse than I thought. Circe glanced at Tam, whose face was a ghastly, pallid shade of white under her freckles. Interesting. Tam turned and fled, somehow using the staff exit in her haste. On a related subject, do you have any idea why one of your students was checking you out? McGonagall glared. Are you seriously asking me that? When it's a 13-year-old girl. Yes I am. McGonagall froze. What? You always were clueless, Minerva. You didn't even realize Tom was interested until I told you he'd been checking you out for months. And even then, I had to tell him to just ask you out already. But now you're an adult and you have kids looking at you like you're more than a piece of meat. What's with that? Circe ignored the fact that she'd begun to drag perfectly kept nails along Harry's arm as she spoke. You what? Yeah. For someone so charming, he didn't think you'd be willing to give him the time of day, being in Slytherin and all. I probably hadn't been helping your impressions, come to think of it. But I told him to stop being a baby and go ask you out. McGonagall began to open her mouth and then stalled, apparently unsure of what to say. I really do wonder what went wrong though. When I graduated, you pretty much had him wrapped around your finger, and he seemed perfectly happy with that. McGonagall stared at her, claws digging through the tablecloth and scoring the wood. Dumbledore smiled to himself before spotting that young Sasori watching the whole exchange with a gaze that was far too interested for someone so young. Albus, his Karkaroff. What in the hells is going on in your school? He was staring at Circe's hands which were just shy of playing with her date's shirt buttons. I do believe we have a predator who is confused by the lack of response from prey. Or just hunting a bigger predator without being part of a pack. Either way, it's quite entertaining, don't you think? Snape sighed. I think I will need to have a word with your son, Ms. Zabini. Despite his status as a professor, he was well aware that she had graduated before he was born and felt distinctly uncomfortable calling a very attractive, older woman by her given name. Why would you need to do that? He told me he was doing well in your class. Has some disciplinary matter come up? Nothing like that. I just think he may try to murder your date. Circe blinked. Why would he do that? I couldn't begin to claim an understanding of the teenage mind. Despite 7 years as one and a further decade teaching them, my ability to fathom the depths of the logic such brains are capable of is simply insufficient to deal with reality. Nevertheless, I am rather good at spotting intended violence after a few years in Professor Potter's company. glad to help, Professor Snape. Of course, he noticed that part. Snape closed his eyes for a moment, then returned to the subject at hand. And I do believe that your son is staring at your date with a look that I normally associate with attempted murder, a particular facial expression I have had a good deal of experience seeing when my former associates didn't wear their masks. Huh. That's odd, my son is usually such a peaceful boy. Well, I'll talk to him. Cersei shrugged and turned back to Professor McGonagall, who was still growling under her breath and trying to dig her claws into the wood. Finally, Pansy's voice had a distinctly unhappy edge to it that sent her date clambering to hide under his chair, fist in his teeth to muffle the terrified sobs. She had been getting less and less pleased by the time it was taking for her food to appear. Daphne and her date had both managed to start their meals, as had Blaise and Hermione. Now she had a meal, and it was cold. It's odd, said Hermione. Her sharp teeth had quickly and efficiently removed all the meat from a drumstick, and she was now using a napkin to clean the associated grease from her lips. You ordered before we did. I am aware of this. If it weren't for Tam's food, you'd probably be in a worse mood than you are. Also true. Though that raises an interesting question, put in Tracy. Why did Tam leave? Through the staff exit, too. Draco shrugged. People do odd things sometimes. I guess maybe something came up? That doesn't sound like Tam. Well, I don't really know her, do I? I'm not looking forwards to dancing, Pansy was grumbling, her gaze trained on the quivering chair beside her. Why not? Draco cocked his head. Your date is a pureblood, right? I haven't the faintest idea. He was just the first idiot I spotted. Does it matter, Malfoy? Hermione sounded waspish. Well, in terms of quality, I refuse to comment. But purebloods are all taught to dance pretty young. Oh. I withdraw my angered statement. Of course, that only applies to the rich ones. As far as I know, the Weasleys don't teach their brood to dance. Probably because they don't have time. I feel like I should object, but that sounds like you're just stating facts. I think so anyway. He gave another shrug. It's not like I spend my time keeping track of what they do. I have better uses for my time. He glanced at Pansy. This all wraps around to my original point. If he's a pureblood, then there's a real chance he can at least pretend. But I don't like dancing. Dancing is something I do when my parents are around, and that means that I need fire whiskey. Oh. Draco looked over at Tracy, confusion etched on his features. Don't ask. All right then. So, what do you think the next task is going to be? Asked Crum. That he was in a good mood was apparent. He had a slight touch of color to his cheeks, normally just tan from hours practicing in the sun. The small glass in his hand held a clear liquid he had called slivovitz, and had ignored his headmaster's disapproving frown when he poured Millie a generous couple of fingers. We are setting aside the ongoing matter of Mr. Sassery's challenges, yes? Fleur, on the other hand, had confined herself to wine that she'd had fetched from the carriage outside. Despite Crum's offer to give her a drink that would help her be a proper woman, she had managed to resist the temptation to set him on fire again. Yep. How goes that, anyway? Not bad. Harry was sticking with water for the most part, but had allowed a small saucer of rice wine since that seemed to be the order of the day among the champions. I think that we'll come into the home stretch on the first round soon. I just hope it's fun. Girl Toby had asked to try each of the liquors in turn and had been turned down by all three. Even Harry didn't think it was a good idea to give her alcohol. In deference to the nature of their discussions, he had allowed that Girl Toby could have a glass of chocolate milk, which had a similar impact on her. Well, considering that you enjoyed the first task so much. The dragon was super friendly. Girl Toby interjected. She kept trying to set me on fire, but she wasn't very good at it. I tried to help her get better and everything. Yes, well, I figure that you might like the next one as well. Crum managed to finish, gesturing randomly with his glass. He wasn't drunk after only a flask of his preferred poison, but having several glasses, and Millie beside him meant he was slightly tipsy. The next task in February, Dumbledore lied in his most helpful tone. It will be the second of the originally planned tasks. And I expect someone to complete the first challenge by no later than a week from tomorrow, said Sasori. He had been watching Harry carefully since the sake had first come out. It was to his everlasting gratitude that his nephew's sage abilities seemed to burn through the alcohol before the world had to find out what chaos a drunk Harry would sow. So, the one involving the egg then? Fleur murmured. I wonder what that stupid rhyme means. It's hard enough taking apart poetry in a proper language. Dissecting words in this bastard tongue is near impossible. It's not much easier for me, admitted Crum. Maybe harder. They don't use as many loans from the mother tongue. If it makes the both of you feel better, I know what the poem means, Harry offered. He neglected to mention that it was because he'd seen the list of tasks in Dumbledore's desk. Will you share? Why? I thought it's supposed to be a surprise? It is, said Dumbledore. Of course, give it a few weeks and I'm sure your fellow champions will have had miraculous breakthroughs in their understanding, which I'm sure will be totally without their judge's assistance. Of course, said Madame Maxime. How dare you accuse us otherwise, said Igor Karkaroff. Mine already knows, said Sasori. It had taken weeks of planning and another month of spreading misinformation to ensure that the right team was sent on the mission. Shikamaru had no idea where the Intel division got the fact that this team was searching for the Six Tails, but it had been essential. Now, things were coming together. It was just a question of whether the strike team was properly selected. Despite how much they wanted to be part of it, Ino and Choji had been left behind. In theory, Shikamaru had no business leading this mission, both because of his personal stake, and because he was still a Chunin, but he'd insisted that he wouldn't reveal his plan otherwise, and no one had been able to convince his family to work it out for them. The team consisted of only 4 people, and 3 of them were there to deal with the other half of the threat, albeit with specific instructions from Shikamaru on how to execute it. Kakuzu leapt backwards as he heard the sound of chirping birds in the bit of scrub that adorned the otherwise bleak landscape of mist. 1,000 birds wasn't something he had personally encountered before, but it was famous as being an assassination technique that alerted its victim and still worked. It occurred to him just a moment too late that the fact that he had the time to leap back meant that he was supposed to do so. But then Hatake Kakashi was streaking out of the gloom with a handful of lightning and a gleaming red eye glowing balefully. Earth Spear wasn't going to be helpful, and it was only sheer luck that let him shift enough that the blade of energy only carved a chunk out of his side instead of ramming into a heart. Good job, grumbled a pink-haired young woman in a Chunin vest came pounding from the murk, fist cocked back. Way to miss the first shot. Kakaza rapidly hardened his skin against impact, and let out a vicious curse when her fist stove in his reinforced hide and neatly tore another hunk of flesh and tentacle from his body. He was running out of spots that weren't his heart, and if he kept facing attacks that ignored his defenses, this was going to be a very hard fight. Haydn raised an eyebrow at the Chunin who stepped out in front of him. One person? That's all I merit? The Chunin blew out a cloud of blue smoke that blended with the mist. Yep. Honestly, I think even one is overkill. You little shit, snarled the man as he threw his scythe. If it weren't for the fact that you killed my mentor, I'm not sure I could have been bothered to actually get involved in this fight. The boy had stepped back a few paces and partly vanished into the mist. I mean, given your actual level of skill, this is really a job for a few genin. I'm going to pull your balls out through your mouth and use your sperm to write my name on your mother's rectum. Haydn dragged his weapon back to him and flung it at the source of the voice. Seriously. Did you ever learn to fight? Or do you just rely on not dying? Because I think I found a flaw in that plan. Come out and say that to my face. I'll grind your flesh to paste and feed it to your family you cunts spewed reject from your mother's womb. You should have dripped down the whore's legs with the rest of that week's deposits. Haydn stormed into the murk, hunting for the voice that just chuckled. Then froze, his limbs not responding to his commands. What the fuck did you do, you piece of donkey smegma? Poisons don't last long on me, and when I'm free, I'm going to clear my blue balls in your guts. I don't propose to tell you. The man slipped into view, one hand formed into a ram seal. The other held a string. But I do appreciate how much you've cooperated in your annihilation. He yanked on the string and dozens of traps twanged, sending wires with dangling trails of explosive tags whirling through the air to encase Haydn. At first, I'd thought I would test the limits of your immortality. Then I realized that it was best to be sure. Primacord in explosive tags, and lots of shaped charges. Haydn's head tilted to look at the ground, which was papered with more chords and notes. Instead, I think I will bury your constituent bits under several tons of rock, and then crush you with earth techniques. If you ever reach hell, tell them you were sent by your superior. Haydn's world exploded. What the fuck was that? Huffed Kakozu. He'd lost his lightning heart to a cheap shot by the copy ninja, while he'd been busy fighting off a dozen orange-clad boys with spinning Sharingan who were taking a great deal of enjoyment at pressuring him with both whirling balls of chakra and gouts of black fire that burned merrily at the ground despite a lack of fuel. Probably your partner dying, replied the pink-haired girl as she drove around the fire heart that had been trying to cut her off and came rushing at him. Hold still and this will hurt like a bitch. This was not how this fight should be going. But Hitaki Kakashi was enough of a threat on his own, and the other two were far more dangerous than anyone their age had a right to be. Especially if that was the Ninetales attacking him. Every time he had what he thought was an exit, there was a group of clones flinging around high-ranked techniques with the same casual disregard for chakra exhaustion as Kisame and Hari demonstrated. And there went his air heart. He'd been trying to line up Kakashi for a pressure damage, and so had kept it inside him, but that meant that he could only afford to send out his fire heart. At least that heart had spotted the blasted original. Hopefully he could force the brat onto the defensive long enough to escape what was now obviously a trap. There was a sound like a bell that became thousands of bells that became an unholy screaming of damned souls. He watched as intelligent hard work flew from the fire heart towards a spot hidden in mist. Then there was a sound like fire hitting fuel and a ball of red flame came running at him, carried by Uzumaki Naruto, wrapped in an ethereal warrior with 3 arms and sporting a tail. The red turned to orange, then yellow, then blue, then white. He had a moment to witness the shield held by one of the warrior's arms slams down between him and the brat, and then the world turned into a series of explosions. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.